Welcome, listeners. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of corporate social responsibility under the Companies Act 2013. I'm excited to explore this topic with you.
Absolutely. It's a crucial aspect of modern business practices in India. The Companies Act 2013 brought some game-changing provisions for corporate governance, didn't it?
Indeed, it did. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of mandatory CSR provisions. These apply to companies meeting specific criteria, requiring them to allocate a portion of their profits towards social welfare activities.
That's right. It's quite a shift from voluntary CSR to a legal obligation. I'm curious, what are some of the key criteria that determine which companies need to undertake these CSR activities?
Well, the Act specifies three main criteria. Companies with a net worth of 500 Indian rupees crore or more, turnover of 1,000 Indian rupees crore or more, or a net profit of 5 Indian rupees crore or more in any financial year are required to comply with the CSR provisions.
Those are some significant numbers. It seems the Act is targeting larger companies with substantial financial capacity. How much are these companies required to spend on CSR activities?
The Act mandates that eligible companies must spend at least 2% of their average net profits made during the three immediately preceding financial years on CSR activities. It's a considerable commitment.
It certainly is. I'm wondering what kinds of activities are considered under CSR. Are there specific areas that companies are expected to focus on?
The Act provides a broad framework for CSR activities. These include efforts to eradicate hunger and poverty, promote education, ensure environmental sustainability, and support rural development projects, among others.
That's quite a range of areas. It sounds like companies have some flexibility in choosing where to direct their CSR efforts. Speaking of which, how do companies typically implement these CSR initiatives?
Companies often establish CSR committees to oversee their initiatives. These committees are responsible for formulating CSR policies, recommending the amount of expenditure, and monitoring the implementation of CSR activities.
Interesting. So there's a structured approach to ensure proper planning and execution. Are there any consequences if a company fails to meet its CSR obligations?
Yes, there are. The Act requires companies to disclose their CSR activities in their annual reports. If a company fails to spend the required amount on CSR, it must provide reasons for non-compliance in its board report.
That's a significant level of accountability. It seems the Act aims to ensure transparency in CSR implementation. Have you come across any notable examples of companies successfully implementing CSR initiatives under this Act?
Absolutely. Many Indian companies have embraced CSR wholeheartedly. For instance, Tata Group has been known for its extensive CSR programs in education, healthcare, and rural development. Another example is Infosys, which has made significant contributions in areas like education and sustainable living.
Those are impressive examples, and it's encouraging to see large corporations making a positive impact. But I'm curious, has there been any criticism or challenges in implementing these CSR provisions?
That's a great question. Some critics argue that mandatory CSR might lead to a tick box approach rather than genuine social responsibility. There have also been concerns about the effective utilization of CSR funds and the need for better monitoring mechanisms.
Those are valid points. It seems like there's still room for improvement in the implementation of CSR under the Act. Before we wrap up, could you summarize the key takeaways from our discussion on CSR under the Companies Act 2013?
Certainly. Let's delve deeper into the eligibility criteria for CSR compliance under the Companies Act 2013. As we mentioned earlier, there are three main criteria, and a company needs to fulfill any one of these to be obligated for CSR activities.
Right, I recall you mentioning those. Could you remind our listeners of the specific thresholds?
Of course, the first criterion is a net worth of 500 Indian rupees crore or more. The second is a turnover of 1,000 Indian rupees crore or more. And the third is a net profit of 5 Indian rupees crore or more during the immediately preceding financial year.
Those are substantial figures. It's clear the Act is targeting larger corporations. But I'm curious, does this apply only to Indian companies?
That's a great question. Actually, these criteria apply to both Indian companies and foreign companies with branches or project offices in India. This ensures that all significant corporate entities operating in India contribute to social welfare.
Interesting. So it's not just about where a company is headquartered, but where it operates. That seems like a comprehensive approach.
Exactly. It's designed to create a level playing field and ensure that all major corporate players in India, regardless of their origin, participate in CSR activities.
That makes sense. But I'm wondering, how do companies determine if they meet these criteria? Is it based on a single year's performance?
Good point. The assessment is typically based on the immediately preceding financial year. So if a company meets any of these criteria in a given financial year, they would be required to undertake CSR activities in the following year.
I see. So it's a year-by-year evaluation. That must keep companies on their toes, especially if they're close to these thresholds.
Absolutely. It encourages companies to be consistently aware of their financial position and its implications for CSR obligations. It's worth noting that once a company becomes eligible for CSR, they're required to continue CSR activities for a certain period, even if they fall below the threshold in subsequent years.
That's an important point. It prevents companies from ducking in and out of CSR obligations. Speaking of which, how do these criteria impact newer or growing companies?
Well, for startups and growing companies, these thresholds act as a kind of milestone. As they approach these figures, it signals that they're reaching a size where they're expected to take on greater social responsibilities.
That's an interesting perspective. It's almost like a rite of passage for corporate growth in India. Before we move on, is there anything else our listeners should know about these eligibility criteria?
Yes, it's important to emphasize that meeting any one of these criteria is sufficient to trigger CSR obligations. A company doesn't need to meet all three. Also, these figures are reviewed periodically, so companies need to stay updated on any changes to the thresholds.
That's a crucial point. It highlights the need for companies to stay informed about CSR regulations. This discussion really underscores how the Act aims to ensure that companies that have achieved significant financial success contribute back to society.
Now that we've covered the eligibility criteria, let's move on to the CSR expenditure requirements. As we mentioned earlier, companies meeting these criteria are required to spend at least 2% of their average net profits on CSR activities.
That's right. It's quite a significant commitment. How exactly is this 2% calculated?
The 2% is calculated based on the average net profits made during the 3 immediately preceding financial years. Importantly, this is based on the profit before tax, PBT, as per the financial statements.
I see. So it's not just based on a single year's performance, but an average over 3 years. That seems like a more stable approach.
Exactly. It helps smooth out any year-to-year fluctuations in profits. Now, it's crucial to understand that this CSR expenditure isn't treated as a business expense.
Oh, that's interesting. So companies can't write it off as a cost of doing business?
Correct. The Act views CSR expenditure as a way for companies to give back to society rather than as an operational expense. This distinction is important for how it's accounted for.
I can see how that might impact how companies approach their CSR initiatives. Are there any other specific rules about how this money should be spent?
Yes, there are. One key point is that any surplus arising from CSR activities must be reinvested in CSR initiatives. It can't be added to the business profits.
So if a company's CSR project generates some income, that money has to go back into CSR?
Precisely. It ensures that CSR funds remain dedicated to social welfare activities. This requirement reinforces the idea that CSR isn't meant to be a profit-generating activity for the company.
That makes sense. It prevents companies from using CSR as a backdoor way to increase profits. Are there any penalties if a company fails to meet this 2% requirement?
The Act requires companies to disclose their CSR activities in their annual reports. If they fail to spend the required amount, they must provide reasons for non-compliance in their board report.
So it's more about transparency and explanation rather than direct penalties?
Exactly. The idea is to encourage compliance through disclosure and accountability. However, recent amendments have introduced stricter measures for unspent CSR amounts.
That's good to know. It seems like the regulatory framework is evolving. Before we move on, could you summarize the key points about CSR expenditure requirements?
Certainly. Let's dive into the eligible CSR activities as outlined in the Companies Act 2013. The Act provides a broad framework, allowing companies to choose from a wide range of social welfare initiatives.
That's great. It seems like this flexibility allows companies to align their CSR efforts with their core competencies and values. What are some of the key areas that companies can focus on?
Well, there are several areas. First, companies can work towards eradicating hunger, poverty, and malnutrition. This could involve setting up food banks, nutrition programs, or supporting sustainable agriculture initiatives.
Those are certainly pressing issues in many parts of India. What about education? I imagine that's another important area.
Absolutely. Promoting education, including special education and vocational skills training, is another key area. Companies can invest in school infrastructure, provide scholarships, or support adult literacy programs.
That's crucial for long-term social development. Are there any environmentally focused activities that companies can undertake?
Yes, ensuring environmental sustainability is a significant part of eligible CSR activities. This could include conservation of natural resources, maintaining air and water quality, or promoting renewable energy.
That's timely, given the growing emphasis on environmental issues globally. What about cultural initiatives? Is there room for that in CSR activities?
Indeed, there is. The Act includes protection of national heritage, art, and culture as eligible CSR activities. Companies can support the restoration of historical sites, promote traditional arts and crafts, or sponsor cultural events.
That's a great way to preserve India's rich cultural heritage. Are there any activities specifically targeted at supporting vulnerable groups?
Yes, the Act includes measures for the benefit of armed forces veterans, war widows, and their dependents. Companies can set up support programs, provide financial assistance, or create employment opportunities for these groups.
That's a thoughtful inclusion. It's important to support those who have served the nation. What about rural development? That seems like a critical area for India's growth.
You're right. Rural development projects are explicitly mentioned as eligible CSR activities. This could involve improving infrastructure, promoting sustainable livelihoods, or enhancing access to healthcare in rural areas.
These all sound like impactful areas. Is there any provision for companies to respond to unforeseen circumstances like natural disasters?
Absolutely. Disaster management, including relief, rehabilitation, and reconstruction activities, is included in the list of eligible CSR activities. This allows companies to contribute effectively during crises.
That's crucial, especially given India's vulnerability to various natural disasters. How do companies typically implement these activities? Do they have to do everything themselves?
Great question. Companies have the flexibility to implement these activities directly or through implementing agencies. These can be registered trusts, societies, or nonprofit companies set up by the company itself, its holding or subsidiary, or any other company.
That seems like a practical approach. It allows companies to leverage existing expertise in the social sector. Are there any restrictions on which implementing agencies companies can work with?
Yes, there are some guidelines. The implementing agency should have an established track record of at least 3 years in undertaking similar activities. This ensures that the CSR funds are utilized effectively by experienced organizations.
That makes sense. It helps maintain the quality and impact of CSR initiatives. This is quite a comprehensive framework for CSR activities. It seems to cover a wide range of social and environmental issues.
Now that we've covered the eligible CSR activities, let's dive into the CSR policy and implementation aspects. The Companies Act 2013 requires companies to formulate a CSR policy outlining the activities they plan to undertake and how they'll allocate their budget.
That sounds like a crucial step in the CSR process. What exactly should this policy include?
The CSR policy needs to specify the projects or programs the company plans to undertake, falling within the purview of Schedule 7 of the Act. It should also outline the modalities of execution and the implementation schedules.
I see. So it's not just about stating intentions, but also about detailing how these intentions will be put into action. Who's responsible for creating this policy?
The responsibility lies with the CSR committee of the company's board of directors. They formulate and recommend the CSR policy to the board. The board then reviews and approves the policy.
That's interesting. It seems to ensure that CSR is taken seriously at the highest levels of the company. What happens after the policy is approved?
Once approved, the company is required to disclose the contents of the policy on its website. This promotes transparency and allows stakeholders to understand the company's CSR focus areas.
That's a great way to hold companies accountable. Speaking of implementation, what are the key steps involved in putting the CSR policy into action?
Implementation involves several key steps. First, the CSR committee recommends the amount of expenditure for CSR activities. Then, they monitor the CSR policy of the company to ensure it's being followed.
So the committee plays a crucial role not just in policy formation, but also in execution. How do companies typically carry out their CSR activities?
Companies have flexibility here. They can implement CSR activities themselves or through implementing agencies. These could be NGOs, trusts, or even specialized CSR foundations set up by the company.
That's interesting. It allows companies to choose the most effective way to carry out their CSR initiatives. But who's ultimately responsible for compliance?
That's an important point. Even if the implementation is delegated to an external agency, the company remains responsible for complying with CSR provisions. They can't outsource the responsibility.
I see. So companies need to be actively involved in their CSR initiatives even if they're not directly implementing them. Are there any best practices for effective CSR implementation?
Absolutely. Regular monitoring and evaluation of CSR projects are crucial. Many companies set up dedicated CSR teams to oversee implementation and track progress against set objectives.
That makes sense. It ensures that CSR efforts are actually making an impact. Before we wrap up this section, could you summarize the key points about CSR policy and implementation?
Certainly. Let's shift our focus to CSR reporting and disclosure requirements under the Companies Act 2013. Transparency is a crucial aspect of CSR, and the Act has specific provisions to ensure companies are accountable for their CSR activities.
That's an important point. What exactly are companies required to disclose about their CSR initiatives?
Companies are mandated to include a comprehensive report on their CSR activities in their annual report. This report must contain several key elements, starting with a brief outline of the company's CSR policy.
I see. So it's not just about actions, but also about clearly communicating the company's CSR strategy. What other information needs to be included?
The report must also detail the composition of the CSR committee. This typically includes the names of the committee members and their roles within the company.
That adds a personal touch to the reporting. It shows who's responsible for driving the CSR initiatives. What about financial information?
Financial disclosure is indeed a crucial part. Companies need to report their average net profit for the last 3 financial years, as well as the prescribed CSR expenditure, which is 2% of this average net profit.
That provides a clear picture of the company's financial commitment to CSR. I assume they also need to report on actual spending?
Absolutely. The report must include details of CSR spent during the financial year. This includes both the total amount spent and a breakdown of how it was allocated across various projects or programs.
That's comprehensive. It allows stakeholders to see not just how much was spent, but also where the money went. Is there any provision for companies that don't meet their CSR spending target?
Yes, there is. If a company fails to spend the prescribed amount on CSR activities, they must provide reasons for not spending the amount in their board report. This ensures accountability even in cases of non-compliance.
That's interesting. It puts pressure on companies to either meet their CSR obligations or explain why they couldn't. Are there any other disclosure requirements?
Yes, companies are also required to display their CSR policy on their official website. This ensures that the information is easily accessible to the public, not just shareholders.
That certainly promotes transparency. How do these reporting requirements impact companies' approach to CSR?
These requirements have significantly influenced corporate behavior. They've led to more structured and strategic approaches to CSR. As companies know, their efforts will be scrutinized by stakeholders.
I can see how that would drive more thoughtful CSR initiatives. Before we conclude, could you summarize the key takeaways on CSR reporting and disclosure?
Absolutely. Let's move on to an important aspect of CSR under the Companies Act 2013, non-compliance and penalties. Initially, the Act didn't specify penalties for non-compliance with CSR provisions, but amendments in 2019 introduced stricter measures.
That's interesting. It seems the government saw a need to tighten regulations. What are some of these stricter measures?
One key change is that unspent CSR amounts must now be transferred to a special account within 30 days of the end of the financial year. This ensures that the funds are set aside for their intended purpose.
I see. So companies can't just let the money sit in their general accounts. What happens to this transferred amount?
Well, companies have 3 years to spend this amount on CSR activities. It's a way to give them some flexibility while still ensuring the funds are used for social welfare.
That makes sense. But what if a company fails to comply with these requirements? Are there specific penalties?
Yes, there are. The 2019 amendments introduced quite severe penalties. For instance, the company itself may face a fine ranging from 50,000 Indian rupees to 25 Indian rupees lakh for non-compliance.
Those are significant amounts. Are there any consequences for individuals within the company?
Absolutely. Officers in default can face even harsher penalties. They may be imprisoned for up to 3 years or fined between 50,000 Indian rupees and 5 Indian rupees lakh, or both.
Wow, that's serious. It seems the government is really committed to ensuring corporate participation in social welfare. How has the corporate sector responded to these stricter measures?
It's been a mixed response. Many companies have stepped up their CSR efforts, while others have expressed concerns about the severity of the penalties. It certainly sparked more dialogue about corporate responsibility.
I can imagine. These penalties really underscore the importance of CSR compliance. Do you think this approach has been effective in increasing corporate participation in social welfare?
That's a great question. While it's still relatively early to assess the full impact, we've seen increased attention to CSR activities and more structured approaches to implementation. Companies are definitely taking their CSR obligations more seriously.
That's encouraging to hear. It seems like the amendments have achieved their goal of promoting corporate social responsibility. Before we move on, could you summarize the key points about non-compliance and penalties?
Certainly. The main takeaways are that unspent CSR amounts must be transferred to a special account. Companies have 3 years to spend these funds, and noncompliance can result in significant fines for both the company and its officers. These measures reflect the government's commitment to ensuring corporate participation in social welfare.
Thanks for that summary. It really highlights how CSR has evolved from a voluntary activity to a serious legal obligation. Now, you mentioned earlier that we'd look at some successful CSR initiatives by Indian companies. Shall we explore that next?
Absolutely. Let's dive into some case studies of successful CSR initiatives implemented by Indian companies under the Companies Act 2013. These examples really showcase how corporations can create meaningful social impact.
That's fantastic. It'll be great to see how companies are putting these CSR provisions into practice. Which company shall we start with?
Let's begin with the Tata Group, specifically their Tata Strive program. This initiative focuses on youth employability, which is a critical issue in India given its large young population.
Interesting choice. What exactly does the Tata Strive program do?
Tata Strive provides skill development and training to youth from underprivileged backgrounds. The program offers courses in various sectors like hospitality, retail, and automotive, equipping participants with industry-relevant skills.
That sounds impactful. How has this program performed in terms of results?
The results have been quite impressive. As of 2021, Tata Strive had trained over 300,000 youth across 23 states in India. More importantly, a significant percentage of these trained individuals have secured employment or started their own businesses.
Those are remarkable numbers. It's a great example of how CSR can address critical social issues. What's another noteworthy CSR initiative we could look at?
Another excellent example is Mahindra's Nanhi Kali project, which supports education for underprivileged girls.
That's certainly an important area. How does this project work?
Nanhi Kali provides academic, material, and social support to girl children from economically disadvantaged families. This includes supplying school kits, providing after-school tuition, and working with communities to change attitudes towards girls' education.
It's addressing both practical and social barriers to education. That's comprehensive. Do we have any data on its impact?
Yes, we do. As of 2020, the Nanhi Kali project had supported over 450,000 girl children across India. The program has seen significant improvements in enrollment rates and academic performance among its beneficiaries.
That's truly inspiring. It shows how targeted CSR efforts can make a real difference. Do we have time for one more example?
Absolutely. Let's look at ITC's eChupal initiative, which is an excellent example of leveraging technology for rural development.
eChupal? That's an intriguing name. What does this initiative involve?
eChupal is a web-based initiative that provides farmers with crucial information and services. It includes real-time weather updates, market prices, and agricultural best practices, all accessible through village internet kiosks.
That's innovative. It's addressing the information gap that often hinders rural development. How widespread is this initiative?
As of 2021, eChupal had reached over 4 million farmers across 35,000 villages in 10 states. It significantly improved agricultural productivity and increased farm incomes in these areas.
These case studies really bring to life how CSR can create sustainable impact. They all seem to align well with the company's core competencies too.
You're absolutely right. These examples demonstrate how companies can leverage their expertise to create meaningful social impact. Now, let's shift our focus to some of the challenges companies face in implementing CSR activities under the Companies Act 2013.
That's an important aspect to consider. Even with clear guidelines, I imagine companies encounter various obstacles. What are some of the main challenges?
One of the primary challenges is identifying suitable projects that align with both the company's values and the Act's requirements. Companies often struggle to find initiatives that are both impactful and relevant to their business.
I can see how that could be tricky. It's about striking a balance between social impact and strategic fit, right?
Exactly. Another significant challenge is ensuring effective utilization of funds. While companies are required to spend 2% of their profits on CSR, it's not just about spending money, but about creating real impact.
That makes sense. It's one thing to allocate funds, but quite another to use them effectively. How do companies typically address this issue?
Many companies are now focusing on long-term sustainable projects rather than one-off initiatives. They're also partnering with experienced NGOs to leverage their expertise in social development.
That sounds like a smart approach. Are there any challenges related to measuring and reporting the impact of these initiatives?
Absolutely. Measuring and reporting impact is a significant challenge. It's often difficult to quantify the social impact of CSR activities, especially in the short term. Companies struggle to develop meaningful metrics that go beyond just financial expenditure.
I can imagine that's particularly challenging for projects addressing complex social issues. How are companies tackling this?
Some companies are investing in sophisticated impact assessment tools and methodologies. Others are collaborating with academic institutions to develop more robust evaluation frameworks. It's an evolving field.
Interesting. It seems like there's still room for innovation in this area. What about balancing CSR activities with business objectives? That must be a delicate act.
Indeed, it is. Companies often grapple with aligning their CSR initiatives with their core business strategy. There's a constant tension between pursuing social good and maintaining business performance.
I can see how that could be challenging, especially for publicly traded companies answerable to shareholders. How are companies navigating this?
Many are adopting the concept of shared value, where CSR initiatives are designed to benefit both society and the company's long-term business interests. For example, a tech company might focus its CSR on digital literacy programs, which also expands its future customer base.
That's a clever approach. It creates a win-win situation. Are there any other significant challenges we should discuss?
One more crucial challenge is engaging employees and stakeholders in CSR initiatives. While companies are mandated to undertake CSR activities, creating a culture of social responsibility throughout the organization can be difficult.
That's an important point. CSR shouldn't just be a top-down mandate, but something that resonates throughout the company. How are companies addressing this?
Many are implementing employee volunteering programs and integrating CSR goals into performance evaluations. Some are also involving employees in the selection and implementation of CSR projects to foster greater engagement.
Those sound like effective strategies. It seems like overcoming these challenges requires a combination of strategic planning, stakeholder engagement, and a genuine commitment to social responsibility.
Absolutely. Now let's turn our attention to the future of CSR in India. The landscape is evolving, and there are several exciting trends and developments on the horizon.
That's intriguing. What are some of the key trends you're seeing in the CSR space in India?
One significant trend is the increased focus on sustainable development goals. Many companies are aligning their CSR initiatives with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, creating a more global and standardized approach to social responsibility.
That makes sense. It provides a common framework for companies to work towards. What other trends are emerging?
There's a growing emphasis on impact measurement and reporting. Companies are moving beyond just disclosing their CSR expenditure to demonstrating the tangible outcomes of their initiatives.
That's crucial for accountability and continuous improvement. How are companies approaching this?
Many are investing in sophisticated data analytics tools and partnering with research institutions to develop more robust impact assessment methodologies. It's becoming a science in its own right.
Interesting. Are there any shifts in how companies are integrating CSR with their overall business strategy?
Definitely. We're seeing a trend towards greater integration of CSR with business strategy. Companies are recognizing that CSR isn't just about compliance, but can be a driver of innovation and competitive advantage.
That's a significant shift in perspective. How is this playing out in practice?
For example, some companies are developing products and services specifically for underserved markets as part of their CSR initiatives. This not only creates social impact, but also opens up new business opportunities.
That's a smart approach. It seems like the lines between CSR and business strategy are blurring. What about collaboration in the CSR space?
Collaboration is indeed becoming more prevalent. We're seeing an increase in collaborative CSR initiatives among companies, even those in different sectors. This allows for pooling of resources and expertise to tackle larger social challenges.
That's exciting. It could lead to more impactful and wide-reaching initiatives. Are there any new areas that CSR activities are expanding into?
Yes, the scope of CSR activities is broadening. We're seeing more focus on areas like digital literacy, mental health, and building health infrastructure, areas that have become particularly relevant in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Those are certainly critical areas. It's good to see CSR evolving to address current societal needs. What do you think all these trends mean for the future of CSR in India?
I believe we're moving towards a more mature and impactful CSR ecosystem. As companies become more adept at implementing CSR, we can expect to see more innovative and effective initiatives that create lasting social change.
That's an optimistic outlook. It seems like CSR in India is evolving from a compliance exercise to a strategic imperative for companies.
Exactly. And as this evolution continues, we can hope to see even greater positive impact on society and sustainable development in India.
Thank you for this insightful discussion on the future of CSR in India. It's been fascinating to explore how corporate social responsibility is evolving and its potential for creating meaningful change.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of corporate social responsibility under the Companies Act 2013. We hope this discussion has provided valuable insights into the legal framework, implementation strategies, and future prospects of CSR in India. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the world of corporate responsibility.